Well, shalom, and welcome to the Roundtable Talks. I am your host, Yeshaya Gruber, and today my guest is a historian of science. GGorelik is a research fellow at the Center for the Philosophy and History of Science at Boston University. He has written on many of the most famous physicists of the 20th century, and is currently working on the role of underlying philosophical beliefs in stimulating the scientific revolution in Europe. Gennady, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
It's a great pleasure, and I've really been looking forward to this conversation, which opens up so many avenues for fruitful thought. Maybe before we get into the meat of the issues, you could just tell us a little bit about yourself, where you come from, how you came to this topic, um, how you became a historian of science, interested in these types of questions.
Okay. I was trained as a physicist at Moscow University, and for quite a few years, I think about 10 years, I considered myself as a physicist, theoretical physicist. But then, thanks to Soviet power and other circumstances, I have to turn to history of science. And at first, I wasn't quite happy, but now I'm absolutely happy that it helped me to understand what the feeling of a physicist when you are thinking about other physicists. I wasn't a great physicist; it was just a beginner, but it was very helpful. So most of my professional life as a historian of science, I dealt with the physics of the 20th century, mainly theoretical physics, and mainly the fundamental physics, I would say. So it's the forefront of the research. And I've written a biography of three remarkable Russian theoretical physicists, very different. Two of them very famous in Russia, at least. One is Andrei Sakharov, who was the father of the Soviet hydrogen bomb, and the Nobel Prize, Peace Nobel Prize. It's a quite incredible combination. The second was, no, the first one was the least famous from the most remarkable and very young theoretical physicist who lived just 30 years. It's Matvei Bronstein, who was a pioneer of the quantum gravity and made a fundamental work in 1930s and was executed in during the Stalin's Great Terror in 1938. So it was my first encounter. And in fact, Bronstein was mostly responsible for everything in my life, including Sakharov and the biography of Lev Landau, also the Nobel Prize laureate, because just I wouldn't explain all the circumstances, but the widow of Matvei Bronstein was a friend of both Landau and Sakharov, and for me it was a personal perspective of those great theoretical physicists. So, and by the way, it was Bronstein who helped me to turn to the 17th century, quite unexpectedly for me, when I was urged to write a biography of a very dramatic life of Bernstein, who was not only fundamental theoretical physicist, but also the author of the masterpieces story about science for teens. Quite unusual combination also. And it was, I thought that it was very difficult to explain what is quantum gravity for the general public. And the idea came to me to start with the very first theoretical physicist, and the simplest one. And I immediately realized that it was Galileo, who was both theoretical physicist and experimental physicist. And that he was really first in my mind. And it was for the first time when I started to read Galileo with I knew about him, of course, but just taking a close look. And I found that this is a mystery, kind of mystery. Why it was Galileo who was the first He wasn't really first because Copernicus, of course, was early, and it was very important for Galileo. And then I just discovered, with the help of one of my friends who was Chinese American theoretical physicist, who introduced me to the so-called Needham question, the famous Needham question. It's a very dramatic story, but it's maybe we will deal with it. So, and the question is, in fact, why Europe, why modern physics was not only was born or invented, I would say, in Europe, but it was developed after that only in Europe. While before that, before Galileo, before Copernicus, European assimilated and learned so much from Islamic science, from Greek science, and from real achievement from India and China. Why it wasn't possible to transfer the knowledge, very openly published, to those great civilization like China, India, and Islamic world? That was the question that I started to think about 10 years ago. And here am I.
Thank you for that. And I think we'll dig into the Needham question more a little bit later in the conversation, if that's okay, because I'd like to deal a bit first with the raw material, so to speak. You were kind enough to send me your paper in progress on the Needham question, and in there you have a large number of quotations from famous physicists throughout history, some of which relate to questions concerning God, creation, the Bible, religion, and so forth. So I think that that will be a special interest for many of our viewers. And before we try to discuss your academic argument about the Needham question, we could just look at indeed some of these quotations. So here's the first slide. Again, I'm just taking these quotations from your own paper. It's a quotation from one of the most famous physicists of all time, Johannes Kepler, a key figure in the scientific revolution, author of the laws of planetary motion and so forth, where he says, "Astronomers are priests of the highest God with respect to the book of nature. They do not promote the praise of the intellect, but above all behold the glory of the Creator." Now, this is obviously very religious language. It's a kind of metaphor, perhaps, but maybe you can explain to us a little bit, what does Kepler mean here in his context? What is he trying to communicate? Why did he use this kind of religious analogy?
Yeah, first let me correct a little bit. He wasn't a physicist, he was an astronomer.
Sure.
I would say he was an astromathematician because there is astrophysicists, and then both he and Copernicus were astromathematicians because they, in fact, dealt with a physical object, the largest one. It was the solar system. For them, it was just universe, not the solar system, but the universe. And there was maybe the most amazing fact, raw fact, I would say, that if we would, from the great physicists of in history of modern physics, just select those who invented new fundamental concepts, there are just 8 of them. All the great physicists and astronomer would be in hundreds, I believe. But those who invented a very new fundamental concept are just 8. And the most striking fact for me was that all of them, 100%, were theistically perceiving the world. And it is pretty strange because atheists are prevailing among physicists, not only today, but in the old times. There was saying that 3 physicists to 2 atheists. And this proportion, by the way, somehow kept up to this century. In the late 90s, there was a poll by most respectable magazine, Nature, that published the result that about 40% of American physicists, biologists, and mathematicians told that they are believers. But in physics, it's less. It's about 20%. But what is strange that from those who every physicist would agree that they are really great guys. Those, all of them, just let me name them: Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Maxwell, Planck, Einstein, and Bohr. Eight person, magnificent eight.
Mhm.
So it's from it is this language is just expressing their perception of the world, and now we know quite a few fundamental laws of nature, and every schoolboy, every school child is learning some of these laws as something absolutely natural. But there was not so in the time of Kepler. And Einstein expressed it very clearly that the very idea of universal law, fundamental law of nature, was not accepted at all. So, in fact, Galileo and Kepler were the first who discovered the first fundamental laws. And this language is just expressing their inner machinery, I would say. And Einstein emphasized that uh, what moved Kepler, by the way, who came to his famous planetary laws by analyzing a huge empirical material observation produced by Tycho Brahe, another great astronomer. Uh, and he came to his idea that every planet governed by the same law, and all of them are moving in the same way. It was pretty strange by the time, because the most popular system was made by Ptolemy. Only Copernicus changed the view, but it wasn't accepted all the same by everybody. It was strange that the Earth is moving. Nobody would. This idea seemed absurd even in Copernicus' eyes. So he understood that it's very difficult, even if it was first suggested even in the old by old Greek scientists, but it was rejected by Greek astronomers. So Copernicus somehow did it in contrast to Greeks. And both Kepler and Galileo, despite the strange the question why we don't see that the Earth is moving, why we don't feel it, because if the calculation, if to believe the calculation, the Earth is moving with a huge velocity. It's about 30 kilometers per second. And why we don't see, if we're moving fast enough on the horse or something like that, we just feel it. So for, as Einstein stressed, only how profound should be the faith in the law, in the existence of the law, to look for this law. So for both for Copernicus and Kepler, idea of the lawful universe and the intelligibility of those laws by a human being was the basic philosophical, or more properly say, religious idea. And it would just help them. It was kind of spiritual doping for them to be brave enough, to be bold enough, and to be consistent enough to seek the truth.
That's really fascinating, and I wonder if you can just clarify a little bit about this question of seeing all planets or all of nature observing a single fundamental law. You were going back and forth between the ancient Greek situation and then the scientific revolution and the modern period. It's interesting because Philo of Alexandria, who was a Jewish philosopher of the first century, in that Hellenistic environment, he actually opened his commentary on Genesis, appealing to a Greek-speaking audience, by saying that just as there are laws in nature, so too there are laws in human behavior, in morality. And this is why Moses begins with the story of creation and then goes on to laws about human behavior. So my question is kind of about the ancient conception and then how it transfers or doesn't to the later period that you're talking about. I mean, is the difference simply applying the idea of a fundamental law of nature to the Earth as well as other planetary bodies, or are you saying that um, the dominant paradigm became one where there wasn't really a belief that there was a fundamental principle at all governing the universe? Can you just clarify for those of us who are not expert
Yeah.
in this field?
Uh, I think very fruitful is just to look at the biblical view of the world, because for them it was most important source. All of them, all of those physicists and astronomers were heretics, of course, because they were free thinking, and without not being heretics, they wouldn't invent something new, really new. And they were also free thinking in religion as well as in science, but they took Bible as seriously as they took nature. And Galileo was the first who pronounced it very clearly and very laconically that nature and scripture have the same author, so they couldn't contradict each other. But they are separated. That the Bible is teaching the human being about who are they and how could they should they live to be saved, to reach salvation, um, uh, regardless of what it means. And the nature is is very carefully perform the laws that God put on the nature. So as in the Bible, the idea comparison of the laws of movement of sun and moon, it's a very usual idea that is kind of um, the what a commandment of God should be as exact as the law that he established for sun and moon. But so for them, the idea that it should be a lawful universe quite clearly on the very first pages of the Bible. And but most important, I think, was the idea that the universe was created for the sake of man, human being as a crown of the universe, and he should they had a mission to rule of all over the other creation. But to rule, you have to understand how to rule. To understand it means to probe into the to the physics, biology of everything, like birds and fish and so on. And it's quite natural that man was endowed by some ability to understand the nature. So they should work. It's hard. It's not easy. And Galileo was very clear that nature doesn't care about how easy it is understood. But as he put it, God endowed the human being by senses, intellect, and language to do it by their own. So for them, it was the biblical ideas of who is human being and what is his mission was very important.
Well, I will have some more questions about that
Mhm.
later on, but let's move maybe to the next set of quotations, which actually picks up on this theme of what is a human being? How can a human being relate to nature and understand it? So, a contrast here.
Yeah.
Steven Weinberg, the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. And on the other hand, Andrei Sakharov, who you mentioned earlier, um, the great Soviet physicist, we cannot imagine the universe and human life without some origin of meaning, without a source of spiritual warmth, being outside matter and its laws.
I believe it's your translation. You try to translate it because he said I cannot imagine.
I cannot. Well, yes, I think it was cut off. The beginning
Yeah,
was cut off, and so I just
yeah.
supplied that there. Yes.
And that is very important fact that the atheist and theist are working together in physics, and there is a lot of work done by great physicists who were absolutely atheists. And among Nobel Prize winners, there's a lot of them. And in my personal communication with physicists in Russia, I very carefully and very substantially talked with some of them, like academician Ginsburg, who was a Nobel Prize laureate, and others who were atheists. So this is, I believe it's a fundamental fact of history of science, or history of culture, I would say,
I think.
that
Sorry to
atheists.
interrupt. I think Feynman probably was also an atheist. That's another name people might know.
Yes, I think
Um,
so. He stated something like that. Even he was raised as in religious school, and he told us so. Yes, so this is a fact that the worldview is very important, and Sakharov understood it very well. Majority of his colleagues were atheists. His teacher, his father, who taught him first physics, his father was a physicist also. His colleagues, most of them, not all of them, but a few were religious in that of in some form. Not specifically churchgoers, but with real belief, like Bogolyubov, who was an Orthodox Christian, and
Fitting for
Sakharov.
his name. Very fitting
Yeah,
for his name.
yeah, absolutely,
Universe.
yeah. And there was
Love. For those who don't know Russian, it's comprised of the two
love.
roots meaning God and love. So
Yes, loving God. Yes, exactly. And he was from the family of priests. Naturally, this last name is usual for some priests. But there was also a very close colleague of him who was a Jew, observant Jew. Uh, and he himself was raised as an Orthodox Christian, but at the age of 12, he realized that it was too narrow for him. Uh, and he visited. His mother was a believer, and she raised him as an Orthodox Christian. But his father was an atheist. But he never discussed. They in family never discussed this issue, as he remembers. So it was an atmosphere of spiritual freedom. And when he realized that he is not that the Orthodox Church is, he couldn't feel there as belonging to them. It was said. It was said for mom, but she never complained, never tried heavily. But as when he became adult enough and started to think about the stuff beyond the physics itself, he realized that he was, in fact, he inherited this biblical view on the universe. Even he never used the term God in his memoir, only in his diary, because what is a source of spiritual warmth? It's feeling, it's love. And love to whom? From whom? So he just tried to avoid the terms that in public perception are too closely connected with some specific rituals and superstition, I would say. In Russia, it was absolutely the fact. But he was when he was asked directly, was he an atheist? He declined it. No, but he wouldn't claim that he is belonged to some church. Um, so, so he understood very well that the people, physicists, his colleagues, are free to choose what is their view on the world. So Weinberg has the full right to be what he who is. But returning to our great magnificent eight, yes, 100%, I believe. And it's an interesting connection. It's strange enough. Why so? But the empirical fact of history of science is that all the greatest physicists who invented new fundamental concepts, all of those concepts are invisible. They look first as illogical because they're really new, and most of them were perceived first by their colleagues as something very suspicious, and they won only after they became successful in explaining natural phenomena.
That's a fascinating insight, and I wonder if we can move to one of those eight, perhaps the most famous name that
Yeah.
people know today, and one of the most famous quotations that relates to this topic. And I put the German there as well, raffiniert, because it's hard to translate. And this quotation is usually given as subtle is the Lord, but malicious he is not.
Mhm.
But it's subtle or crafty, artful. This quotation by Einstein goes exactly to the point that you're making. If you'd care to elaborate on this
Yeah.
basis.
And in fact, it's the same what Galileo said about God, because that the nature could be could be made very difficult for understanding, but it wasn't crazy, not for understanding, but for providing for human being the conditions for life. You know, so but the hope that nevertheless the nature is comprehensible. There is another famous saying by Einstein that the most incomprehensible thing in the universe is that the universe is comprehensible.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, and he considers it as a miracle, as a mystery. And in fact, it is so, because if you would think about the phenomena close to the daily life, one could say that just the biological evolution would require from a human being as well as from animals to somehow understand his surrounding, because otherwise they wouldn't survive. But when we are thinking about the nucleus of the atoms and the galaxy, there are milliards, billions of light years from the universe. They had no importance for the daily life at all. And nevertheless, the humans are able to understand it, to study experimentally and by observation, and it was mystery for Einstein.
Mhm. I think one way of expressing what he was saying in this quotation would be something like God, the master of nature, creation, the creator, rather, is crafty but not sneaky. He's not trying to trick you and trip you up and cause
Yeah, yeah,
problems.
absolutely. Yeah.
But this idea, didn't it also lead Einstein into some problems when quantum mechanics was discovered? And this was a problem for him because he expected things to be more orderly in his own conception than they were. Maybe you can tell us about his interaction with Niels Bohr and how it relates to this idea.
Yeah, this is a very famous debate because two of them were the greatest scientists of the 20th century. Each of them respected and admired other very much. And Einstein used to say that the Bohr's discovery of the atom as a model of atom, the very first quantum theory, that he wouldn't be able to do this because it's so difficult from the so shaky experimental data. How could he invent it? Came to this to his idea. And here we took a very tricky step, because um, uh, the main feature of human being is their creative ability. It's the only thing that distinct the human being from the animals, I would say, because animals are living the same way as they lived millions of years ago, not the human being. We are surrounded by everything that was created by us, not by nature. And this creativity is a mystery. And psychology has no real understanding and how could one create a new idea, really new idea, not to develop the previous one, not to make a small step, but something so unusual as, for example, to suggest that there is a gravity. Why Newton could imagine that there is something invisible that we don't feel. We don't feel. We see the subject that are falling to the earth, but it has no relation to the universal gravity that everybody is attracted to each other with this very specific law. So this creativity, as Einstein used to say, that all it's not just intellectual activity. It's something, as he said, that our moral views, our sense of beauty, and our religious instinct, all of that contribute to the highest intellectual achievement of human being. So, and exactly when scientists suggest a very new concept, it doesn't fit the logic of the previous picture of the world. And he should survive for a while to change all the surrounding, all the logic of science, to introduce a really new word of science into the text, into the natural logical text. And it takes some time. So, for example, when Einstein first came to the idea that the space is curved, nobody, by that time, he was a prominent scientist with a great achievement, like a theory of relativity, an idea of the quantum photon or light, a quantum of lights. But when he suggested that the gravity should be described as a property of the curved space, none of his colleagues would take him seriously, even those who admired him, like Max Planck, for example. And it took for him about 8 years to develop his first idea, his first glimpse to the theory. And the theory predicted the phenomena that he wouldn't expect, like the perihelion of Mercury. Is very he never thought about that that opportunity to explain it. So the mysterious act of creation is based on all the spiritual forces. And as Einstein told that the new concept are free invention of human spirit, not human mind, not human reason, but human spirit. Because they couldn't be logically deduced from some experiment. The experiment is great, and of course the science couldn't be without experiment, but experiments are not suggesting a new concept, a new ideas. Ideas is born in the head, and the heart is helping to head very much.
Mm.
And that is what Einstein understood very well. And by the way, where it was when he was young, he studied and discussed with his friends works by David Hume, who was a skeptic, but he made, I would say, the greatest contribution into the explaining the necessity of religious thinking, because he discovered that you couldn't deduce the moral norms or moral ideas from the experience, from the objective scientific knowledge. No, and he discovered it for the first time in his, and so when Einstein told that only religious tradition could produce a human being, those basis for his aspirations. Knowledge is great, but the aspiration to gain knowledge, but the assurance that it could be possible, that is from somewhere other than the scientific knowledge. And it, in Einstein's words, it was only, as he put it, Jewish Christian religious tradition. Even if he was pretty skeptical about the traditional theological description of God. But I think the best way to express it, Jewish Christian tradition, as a biblical tradition, because it's the main source for him specifically. And he told that he see his feeling, his religious feeling in some of David's psalms and in some prophets' writing. So for him, and here maybe our listener and watcher are aware that he surprised his parents when he, being a child, he developed very profound religious feeling. Despite the family was pretty secular, and they just hired a teacher of the religion just to be culturally involved. So the very ability to perceive a profound religious feeling is not universal. As every ability, it's distributed somehow not evenly. And both musical ability and ability to religious feeling is not available to anybody to for his wish.
Yeah. One thing that certainly stands out in looking at many of these great physicists is that they did feel a sense of wonder and awe at creation, and this is certainly something that is quite biblical as well. Maybe if we look at another physicist who achieved some prominence in modern physics, we can pick up just on what you were saying about this complex nature of relating to God's creation, trying to understand it and not quite being able to understand it, having a new idea come along that doesn't fit with the old one. Do you want to tell us about what Freeman Dyson is saying here? I can read it just for our audience. If it should turn out that the whole of physical reality can be described by a finite set of equations, which is a dream of physicists, isn't it? I would be disappointed. I would feel that the creator had been uncharacteristically lacking in imagination.
Yeah, you know, the idea of the final theory was born only in the 20th century, and Einstein himself first was against this, the first attempt, but then somehow he he started to think not about the final theory, but his idea was to join electricity and gravitation first. But he failed. And it is the very idea that there is a final theory. It's, by the way, it's believed by atheists like Hawking, like Weinberg. They are thinking about the possibility of this one. As to Einstein, he felt mystery. and mystery. He was a miracle. If as he put it, my religious feeling is humble amazement at the ability of our feeble mind to understand the nature to such extent. So there is no idea that it's just as a new gadget. You have a manual and you just look carefully in the manual and you would know everything about this gadget. It's every discovery is a new wonder, a new mystery. And Freeman Dyson, who, by the way, described himself as a practicing Christian, but not believing Christian. And it's interesting because for him, and nevertheless, he was very much in favor that religion and science are both equally important view to of the universe, and that he was against both fundamentalist scientists and fundamentalist religious.
Religion.
Yeah. So
He viewed them as two windows, I think, on the same
yes,
universe.
yeah,
Yes.
exactly. And what is interesting that for those eight magnificent eight, both windows were open. But so,
Right.
so
Right.
and it's interesting that when you couldn't see clearly something in the window of the reason and experiment, take a look at the window of faith and your I would say and your intuitive picture and your faith would be support for your reason and for your inventiveness, and that is what is distinct the biblical view from a few other well-developed sophisticated uh, picture of the world developed by Chinese civilization, by Indian civilization, and the Islamic one. And that is one of the one idea, this unique status of human being, and unique. It was so high that for Indian it seems ludicrous. How you could be sure that the human being is so good? No, not at all. We see so there are so many terrible things. So the belief, the faith, the biblical view of the human being and on the universe was unique in a sense. That is, to my mind, is a main explanation why modern science was so Eurocentric, in contrast to the science of the old Greece. Greek science was successfully assimilated and developed by Muslim scientists in during the golden age of Islam, and they also assimilated the ideas from India and from China. And Europeans were quite successful in assimilating those ideas from other civilizations, but not the other ones. And it's strange.
Well, now we're definitely getting into the Needham question.
Yeah.
And thank you very much for all of those explanations. I mean, we could go on with Einstein quotations all day, of course. He
Oh,
gave
yeah.
so many great insights. In your paper on the Needham question, you point out that he repeatedly said that there are indeed moral foundations for science, which goes to the point you're making, but no scientific foundations for morality. You cannot derive morality from science, which is a fascinating insight, especially today when many people would like to try that. Um,
Yeah,
and
he stressed that science is a wonderful tool to implement your moral goals.
mm,
And without knowing science, you would be just unable to do the good work. I would say so. It's a tool, but no more. The tool could be used both for good and for evil.
right, you would have to derive the morality separately, independently. Um, Another quotation you have there from Einstein is that he said one cannot build a house or construct a bridge without using a scaffolding, which is
Yes.
really not one of its basic parts. And I believe this relates to the issue of how modern science was constructed, was made. So maybe you can explain that to us. What kind of scaffolding was used in order to construct modern science?
Yeah, if we would turn to the first constructor of the modern science, it was Einstein's view, and it's mine also that those was faith supporting those belief assure us that the universe could be understood. Not the universe at once, but just the for Galileo, the main achievement of Galileo was the law of the free fall. It's so simple that school children study this and think it's not a great deal, but it was a really great deal because Newton, in his great triumph of the science, a real triumph, he referred to the Galileo's discovery of the parabolic form of the falling body, and it was so important that it was universal. Anything like a feather and the
Lead
heavy
ball. Yeah.
stone, yeah, would fall in the same way in the empty space, and the empty space in vacuum. It was the Galileo's invention of invisible and forbidden notion. Aristotle, in Galileo's time, the philosopher or scientist, it was the name of scientist of that time, were sure that Aristotle proved that the notion, the very notion of the empty space is false, because there is no empty space. And even Descartes himself somehow was still in this idea that the empty space. But Galileo was brave enough to introduce this notion as a physical notion, not as a philosophical, but as a physical. He was his observation and his experiment made him to his involvement the Archimedes physics, that he considered Archimedes as a most divine scientist, and he employed his Archimedes science to come to the idea that we should formulate the law in the vacuum. And it was vacuum is invisible. He never, in fact, dealt with vacuum on the later, but nevertheless, it was the most important discovery, invention, I would say, not discovery, invention. And so for those discoverers, this kind of discoveries, it was like he the support of those inventions. Why you think you have a right to invent such a strange thing that Aristotle told it's wrong? Why you are so brave? And the source is from, as Galileo told, that the human being are endowed by God by those ability to understand. And for him, mathematics was a kind of example, but this the very idea was very much a biblical one, because when the missionary, Catholic missionary, Jesuit missionary in China tried to explain the same logic as they used, that the God established the law for nature, for Chinese scholars, they were clever one. It sounded absurd, just because the law are created for the human being who could understand the law. And by the way, it's very important idea that the use of the phrase like law of nature was not quite natural. Galileo never used this phrase. He used this phrase only in his theological letter, but not in his book on physics. And only by the end of 17th century, this phrase became quite secular, law of nature. For Galileo, it was law established by God for nature, and he used this phrase. So this scaffolding, as Einstein made it clear, it was the source of this inventiveness is from religious faith, from the sphere of religion. Just believe that.
maybe we can dig into that a little more. In brief, the Needham question is something like asking why the scientific revolution happened in Europe as opposed to some of the other places where you might have expected it to have occurred, like China, which was much more advanced scientifically for many centuries, India, Arabic
Yeah.
civilization that you're mentioning. Um, but is there a necessary reason why it couldn't have happened in those civilizations? Now, here we're obviously speculating and talking about the realm of the hypothetical, but that is what the Needham question is. It's talking about a counter factual history as opposed to, what actually happened, what could have happened. So I think that the perspective that you've explained, including what Einstein says, helps us to understand why things happened as they did. But does it really explain why it couldn't necessarily have happened in another way? Why, in other words, did China develop so rapidly in a scientific way in earlier centuries, prior to the scientific revolution? Were those just a different type of scientific
Yes.
discoveries?
Exactly, exactly. This is the Needham question, as in the form that he formulated, was criticized and very justly, I would say, even by his close collaborators, who are experts in Chinese history and Chinese culture. And but Needham was uniquely qualified to put this question because he has two qualifications. He was a real scientist, biochemist in Cambridge, and he became the one of the most famous sinologists in the last half of his life. Only when he was about 40, he started to think about why, and there was some personal circumstances. He just a few young Chinese research students came to his laboratory of biochemistry, and he somehow put the question for himself, why I never heard about Chinese scientists if these young Chinese are so able and absolutely good scientists. So he started to think this way, and one of those Chinese started to teach him Chinese language, and then he traveled to China. So he became really knowledgeable in Chinese history, much more than Chinese themselves, because he read a lot of their manuscripts of those time, and that is why his question was about why not in China. But
And
yeah,
let's just remind people, or let them know if they don't, that he wrote a, I don't know, 10 volume, maybe very large history of science and technology in China.
yeah,
So he'd be
the book
the
is
authority on this subject.
yeah, the book is Chinese Science and Civilization.
Science and Civilization, right?
Yeah.
Science and
So,
Civilization,
so
exactly.
the term science is somehow ambiguous, in use. Now we have political science, and in Russian it's even a science of love. So, as Pushkin put it. The science as a knowledge about natural world that could be used. If we would see it this way, it would separate philosophy, by the way, as a pure thinking of the mental picture from the real use. And Needham, when he discovered that the Chinese were so great in applying the knowledge about nature to practical things, that is why what amazed him most of all, not just the four great inventions like gunpowder and magnetic compass and paper and printing, but very many sophisticated engineering stuff, like the first tower clock were made in China. And as soon as he realized how successful Chinese were in applying the natural, the knowledge about nature he was he was puzzled why in China. But I think that he was wrong in putting this question. The real question the question that could be answered by in historical way would be why Chinese didn't join the modern science, because something is invented by a genius. A genius is born where he was born. That is just a fact. He wouldn't ask. Neither wouldn't ask why the physics was invented in Italy rather than in Britain, because as soon as Galileo invented it in Italy, it was very soon spread it all over the Europe. Huygens in Holland and Newton in Britain, and even Lomonosov in Russia. All of them were somehow easily perceived this idea and developed this they further, but not to the great civilization like India, who Indian invented the decimal system and the numbers that you sometimes used named as Arabic numbers, but they in fact are Indian. Just Arabs took it to Europe. So that was the question. That is a real question, because after Galileo, for 4 centuries, nobody in those three great civilizations joined the science, and it is strange. It is strange, but it's really a historical question. Because to discuss why Galileo was born in Italy rather than in China is a stupid one and impossible to answer. So the native question in his original formulation is, as put it some of his collaborator, and by the way, opponent to his question, it is heuristic question. And for Needham, who was both scientist and sinologist and the greatest champion of Chinese heritage, he was the main force to make Chinese heritage known to not only to the West but to the Chinese. That is why he is so well accepted in China right now. And so his question sounds like politically incorrect, because it somehow made the Chinese look bad. But Chinese themselves and Chinese historians and Chinese scientists are considering it as a serious, a very interesting question. So the real question, and by the way, the real question, historical question, would be not about just China. We have, if we consider what Galileo really did and what knowledge he used in mathematics, we would, any historian would agree that Archimedes could do it. Archimedes was not only a great physicist, he was a great mathematician and great engineer. Engineer means that he deal with a practical thing, so it's experiment. It's experimental thing, and his physics was absolutely experimental. So this is the issue of what is modern science. And this is a very interesting issue, and I was surprised that the usual traditional definition that, by the way, Needham himself used, is that it is empirical and mathematical. So just empirical, mathematical. But it's wrong. It's wrong just because even Archimedes, two millennia before Galileo, used mathematics wonderfully. It's just, I would say, much better than Galileo himself. Galileo used very simple mathematics. You know, Archimedes was much greater mathematician than Galileo, and nothing in experimental technology that Galileo used couldn't be used by Archimedes. Galileo made it. He didn't buy clocks and something like he invented. He did his clocks. It's very strange by water clock that he used in his experiments. So Archimedes could do it. But if not Archimedes, after Archimedes made his great science in 3rd century BCE, And there were 5 or 6 centuries of Greek-Roman world, and there were some great physicists and mathematicians, not so great as Archimedes, but they were. So something that the question is why they in Greece, in Great Greece, basing on the geometry of Euclid and physics of Archimedes, they didn't do what Galileo did. Why it took 2,000 of years? And this is the real question,
Mm,
a
mm.
historical question.
Yeah, fascinating set of historical questions.
Yeah.
And as Joseph Needham showed in his monumental work, the ancient Chinese also used algebra, and they to invent all of those things and intricate clocks and so forth. They had to use empirical knowledge. So I think what you were saying about the ancient Greeks might apply also to ancient Chinese civilization. But here it goes back to the question I was asking before, and I sense there's um, you probably disagree a little bit with how I've put the question, and I just want to try to see what the correct definition would be of modern science. Where is the boundary? Is it a level of abstraction? Is that what the issue is, or can we characterize it differently?
Yeah. I think that the most relevant definition is that the modern science includes the right of scientists to invent illogical fundamental concepts.
Hmm.
And uh, it's not done every day. It's not done every century, I would say, because after Newton, it took about 2 centuries before Maxwell invented a really new fundamental concept, again invisible. It was electromagnetic field. He was helped very much by experiment by Faraday, but he Faraday ideas were accepted with a great suspicion because Faraday was not mathematically prepared to do the theory, but Maxwell did it. And it wasn't easy because he started trying to do some kind of mechanics of the ether. But then, as a result, he came that there is a fundamental reality like electromagnetic field in vacuum. It it doesn't require any medium to live to exist. So those kind of invention are pretty rare, but only they made the new step, and then those physicists who developed based on this concept are doing a great job. And without their job, they could be atheist. It doesn't. It just it's. You know, I would compare it the easiest way with the constructor set of the like Lego for children. There's two different kind of creativity. You could do from the set of element of Lego something very wonderful construction, and somebody could else invent a new element. That's a really new element to make much more interesting and much more sophisticated construction. And those two kind of creation are working in science. When Bohr invented his concept of discrete quantum states, that electron circling around the nucleus couldn't circle at any place, only a specific distance from the nucleus. Let me be simplify a little bit. And it was absolutely contradicted all the physics of that time. And it took about 20 years, a little bit less, 15 years to make it a real theory, the quantum mechanics. But first, the very concept of the quantum state, of quantum discrete state, this idea was absolutely marvelous, and that was what Einstein told. That is the highest musicality in this of mental activity. So the the right to invent new concept that could be testified by testing the theory based on those concepts is what distinguishes Galileo Einstein science from the Archimedes. Because Archimedes, as well as Euclid, they their idea of the theory of real theory is to find self-evident axioms. Self-evident, it's based on the experience. They are not proved. Axioms are not proved. They are just proclaimed as they didn't need a postulate, you could say. Both Euclid and Archimedes base their theory on a self-evident for everybody who is thinking a little bit, who deal with the just the measuring of Earth, that is geometry, and to wait in the with the on scale in physics like Archimedes. But the theories of the modern physics, starting from Galileo, are based on some concept that is not self-evident at all. Like vacuum for Galileo, like gravity for Newton, electromagnetic field for Maxwell, and the quantum for Planck, quantum of energy, and then the curved space-time. Before that, the velocity of light is constant regardless of the velocity of the source of light. That was those concepts, those ideas were inevident at all. But they proved to be very successful in explaining reality by and were tested by experience. So those strange axioms or fundamental theory in physics, they mostly use not as axiom, but Einstein explained this working of the science using the term of axioms. The invention of axiom is a creative act, mysterious one, just as well as creation of the new music and the new poetry. If you couldn't explain why this poet invented, if it is a really masterpiece, it's just kind of mystery of the same kind that God created the universe from nothing. And if a human being is somehow accustomed to this idea of creativity, he would be feel more safely when he would create something new.
Well, you reached the conclusion in your paper that the extended Needham question helps us to see that modern science could be considered as the secular fruit of the religious culture based on the biblical tradition,
Yeah.
which is a really interesting way of looking at it. And I think listening to you explain it today, it strikes me that a very large part of what enabled that biblical tradition to bear this fruit would be just the emphasis on questioning, the desire to get to the real truth of things, even if you have to uncover layers of appearances, belief in an inspiration, that you can have this poetic type of inspiration, which is very prominent in the biblical prophets, for example, and also just the bravery to speak um, to speak for truth, and to say, well, this doesn't seem right. It doesn't make sense from one perspective or another. We have to go deeper. And I think that in that sense, reading your work, it is kind of an homage also to these important humans throughout history who were willing to do that, and who were brave enough um, to investigate creation in this way. So you've been very generous with your time, and maybe I can just ask you before we close to say a few words about um, some of those people who did truly have to be very brave, not only in the time of the Inquisition, for example, Copernicus, Galileo, and so forth, but Bronstein, who was executed, as part of the purges. Sakharov, who I think had some connection to him as well, became friendly with Bronstein's widow, and then Sakharov became a very famous dissident in the Soviet Union, risking a great deal personally and sacrificing a great deal to try to promote the idea of human freedom and the ability to question freely. So I don't know if you have any thoughts just about that side of things. Sakharov, of course, died in 1989, seeing perhaps the beginnings of a change
Yeah,
in his society. Um, but there were many people, especially, if we're talking about the 20th century, especially in the country that you came from, who sacrificed a great deal and who risked a great deal to speak out about things that we take for granted. Even basic scientific, philosophical concepts you could not necessarily say freely, and it might cost you your life or your freedom, such as it was. And many of these people were Jewish. Sakharov, for example, was not, but I think, was his wife Bonner, I think, was Jewish, and Bronstein and Landau, I assume, were Jewish, and um, so there was some sort of family tradition that influenced them, whether they were aware of it or not, that relates to what you're saying about the biblical tradition. Let's make the Judeo-Christian tradition, let's say.
yeah, yeah.
But maybe you have some final thoughts about
Yeah,
this whole issue.
yeah, I think it's very closely related to the idea of human rights, of universal human rights. And the biblical origin of this idea for me is absolutely evident. And it acts both in science and in social life. And for Sakharov, why so many physicists became active in the human rights activity in human rights defense in Russia was because physics was maybe the main field where the governmental control was not so strong as in humanities. So they found the kind of island where they took where could act freely, really, in physics. But for Sakharov, it was absolutely natural to do it beyond physics because he was raised. I, I, I don't think that the Jewish origin has very much to explain, other than the Jews invented the Bible and a biblical story. But for Sakharov, but by the way, his wife was half Jewish, half Armenian, and she was atheist. And somehow, when I started to write biography of Sakharov, and I asked her about his religious view, her first answer was he was atheist as well as I was. And only when I took her to the phrases in his memoir, he was amazed because he told me how stupid I was. It was me who typed it. And why didn't I ask him what he meant? Because this phrase that you presented is so clearly theistic and so clearly, but somehow for her, he just missed it. So that is, but in in the vicinity of Sakharov in human rights activity, there was about half of believer and half of atheist. And there was one priest, and he was a friend of physicist Kronid Lubarsky, who was an atheist. And those priests, Sergei Zhelitkov, was very expressively expressed his amazement how this physicist, who was imprisoned by the time and was a correspondent, how was he able to do what he did as the best Christian should do without those hopes. So it's the culture was changed by biblical view of so much in Europe. In Europe, because even if the most funny stuff is when I started to look for the origin of the term scapegoat. It seems to be the source is so far from any Christian life. It's a strange Jewish ritual. Um, it described in the Bible, and I started to understand to learn when this term, this word, entered the language. And I found that in Russia, it came only after the Russian translation of the Bible emerged. In England, it was much earlier when the English translation was made. So from this, I have the idea that the real reading of the biblical stories is so important cultural phenomena that for me, the dating of the origin of the modern science was deeply connected with the invention of the book printing and the Reformation, who made the book printing as a main tool to make a Bible as a main source of the faith. So the culture far beyond from the church and is just the human being could could never open the Bible but read Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, to have and other Russian classical writers who, in fact, were all of them were biblically educated and biblically not educated, but with the religious feeling, and so, very different. Tolstoy was very different from them, but nevertheless, it's sort of, so summing up, I would say that the human rights, the idea of human rights, and idea of modern science are relatives, very closely related with the same source. That is why Universal Declaration of Human Rights was, in fact, somehow made in 1948. Mainly by those who were biblically views on the world, even if they were not conventionally religious and any churchgoers, but the culture was there.
Dr. Gennady Gorelik, thank you so much for this fascinating lesson in the history of science, but even more, for showing how much true appreciation of creation and indeed awe at the creator is linked to that story of not only physics, but also, as you say, human rights, our human history. Tolstoy, as you mentioned, another great heretic, not because he was an atheist, not at all, but rather because he desired to dig as deeply as possible to find the truth, and that's what he said. I'm,
Okay.
leaving the official church because I want to serve God. So this has been a really fascinating investigation of. I mean, it's hard to sum this up. The whole story of humanity. I mean, the whole way we understand our universe and our lives. So our gratitude, and I'm sure our viewers will be very grateful as well.
Thank you. My best wishes to your great job.
Thank you. Shalom.
So,